Is Christianity naturally a right-wing pro-capitalist tradition? According to Dr. Joerg Rieger, that's an impression Americans have primarily received since the 1930s. Christianity's roots run deeper, and he argues more consistently with socialism. Dr. Rieger is a distinguished professor of theology at Vanderbilt University. He is a prolific and revered scholar on the subject of Christian socialism, having authored and edited some 24 books and 165 journal articles, and is also a very busy grassroots activist and organizer within that tradition today. Dr. Rieger, thank you so much for taking the time to be here.
Looking forward to the conversation. Thanks for having me.
Let's begin with how you come to this subject. And I know your own life straddles two different countries. You come to the United States from Germany. So how does your life intersect with this subject of Christianity and politics and economics?
So like you said, I grew up in Germany in a bit unusual setting, I guess, because I grew up as a Methodist, which in Germany is a very small tradition. Almost everybody's Lutheran, either Lutheran or Roman Catholic. And so as a Methodist, you oftentimes had to know what is Methodism because people would ask you questions. And so you had a fairly strong religious identity. And oftentimes that was seen with suspicion. So what I learned from that early on was that, religious identity is important, and religious identity is something that can go against the grain. So it can be countercultural, it can be questioning some of the dominant opinions. That was certainly helpful because I never had the feeling that religion and the status quo had to be married, which is, of course, what's happening in many countries, right? The assumption is religion backs up the powers that be, as it were. So for me, that was sort of one of the earliest beginnings that created some openings for thinking differently and for living a different kind of life.
That's really interesting. I mean, there are, and I know in your work you talk about how that's something that is a recurring theme throughout history. Is the fact that you came from a different country to the United States, and I know that you treasure many of American ideals around freedom and democracy, but do you see them perhaps a little bit differently, having come from, in some sense, from the outside, or having a dual perspective, or having a perspective that is both religious and spans different countries?
Definitely. So it's this countercultural understanding of religion. I think that's important, but it's also a way of looking at freedom that might be surprising for some Americans. So looking from Europe, it's really impressive to think about, all the potential freedoms and, the whole question of political democracy. And the United States there was a forerunner, if you think about world history. So looking from Europe, that was always something that we greatly admired. But there was something else we realized, and it took me a while to realize it after I came to the United States, that this freedom that Americans are proud of is also quite restricted. So for instance, when you think about political freedoms, that's one thing, and we can talk about how much that's a reality or not. But when you think about freedom along the lines of economics, the economy, it looks very different. So for instance, workers in the United States have very little freedom to organize. I mean, we see this right now, right? Amazon workers trying to organize, and there's a lot of pushback. And even when they sort of have a vote that they want to organize, they're still not necessarily allowed to organize. If you look at the UN Human Rights Declaration, there's a very clear commitment to collective bargaining as a human right. That's something that's almost taken for granted in Europe. My parents were postal workers, also Methodists, but also members of the union. Right. And that freedom for working people to take things into their own hands, to have a voice and so on, was something that was really important to us in Europe. And coming to the US, that looks very different. So that's one example for where I think freedom is oftentimes understood very differently. And I think there's some growing edges in the United States, because I think as we expand this conversation about it, it makes a lot of sense now to think about what is the freedom of essential workers, everyday people, and so on.
Yeah, that's a great perspective. In fact, I'm not even sure that many people know about that relationship to the Declaration of Rights and Freedoms and the United Nations. I'm not sure if that's something that's commonly understood over here. That might be something that is more common outside of the United States. It's maybe understood a little bit here in Canada, where I'm speaking from, but I still wouldn't say that it's a widespread understanding, and that seems to be a bit of a deal breaker.
I think that's really crucial. And of course, I mean, we're talking about the United States, realizing that there are other examples. So Canada, I think, is a good one that, Americans, US Americans could really learn from a whole lot. But even if you take this question back to Europe, you'd say, well, there are more of these freedoms. I mean, working people in some ways not only have more of a social safety net, that's something that people usually talk about, but they also have some more agency. That's really important. That's the thing that people don't often talk about. But even in Europe, that could be strengthened. Even in Europe, I wouldn't say that that's paradise just yet. It's just for us, what's interesting is how these various traditions inform each other, and then the question is, how does religion make a difference there? And that, to me, of course, that's the work that I'm doing as a theologian, because there's a lot of work that still we're not so clear about that question yet.
When was there a key moment in which you realized that that was going to be the subject that you needed to focus on with your own work?
It sort of grew gradually. Coming to the United States, I did my PhD at Duke University, working with Frederick Herzog, who was really the first white male liberation theologian in the South, which is a very odd thing. You know, we think of liberation theology as, African-American, feminist, womanist, Latinx, and so on, which are all very powerful traditions. But coming to Duke, studying with these various liberation traditions, realizing there was even a white one, was interesting, because those were not questions I had learned in the Theological Academy in Germany. So that was crucial. And then studying questions of racism, sexism, and so on really helped me see how much oppression there was really all about. In the mid-2000s, I wrote a book titled Christ and Empire, From Paul to Post-Colonial Times. And I'm really figuring out in that book how oppressive powers, exploitation, were really paralleling Christianity's history for 2,000 years and shaping it. What really struck me, though, and that's what opened my eyes, was how much Christianity had to offer in resistance. In other words, while dominant powers were shaping Christianity for 2,000 years, they could never take over completely. They did a lot of shaping, but alternatives always remained. And to me, those were some of the questions I really started to pursue more and more. Sort of the positive question: what's the alternative look like? Where does it become a reality? How does it make a difference? And quite frankly, those questions for me had to do with questions of race, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, immigration status. But they pushed me all more and more to the question of economic oppression, because a lot of it comes together there. And so when I started writing about empire, I thought about politics, I thought about cultural predominance, Eurocentrism, all of that. But I realized a lot of this had to do with who wins and who loses. And it took me back into economic relationships. And of course, the 1%, if you want to use that term, that has been very much able to use all these other forms of oppression to their advantage over time.
That's a really wonderful segue into a question I wanted to ask you about, which is a kind of distinction you make between more superficial forms of solidarity and what you call deep solidarity, and the distinction between those two and how important that distinction is for you. Can you expand a little bit onto why we need to talk about deep solidarity as opposed to more superficial forms of solidarity?
Yes, that's a really great question. Thank you so much for putting that so clearly. Let me say a couple of things. First of all, solidarity can be both a problem, and I think it can also be the solution. The reason we need solidarity, I realized over time, is that none of us can win these tremendous fights that are going on by themselves. So if all you have is minority politics, maybe you can win inclusion, maybe you can win some respect, some tolerance, which is good, which is important, but you can't really affect systemic change. And so the reason solidarity is needed, it seems to me, is that all those, in the Occupy Wall Street movement days, we talked about the 99%, the 99% need to realize that maybe they have something in common. Now, that's sort of the need for solidarity. The problem with solidarity is that on the right, there is also a solidarity emerging and being built that's problematic. The solidarity on the right is the kind of solidarity that brings people together, makes a march in lockstep, makes everybody alike, requires everybody sort of to be erasing their differences. That cannot be the solidarity on the left that we're talking about. So deep solidarity here recognizes the differences that the solidarity of the right tries to erase, and it puts them to work constructively. So the thing then is, if you think about all these different movements coming together, I mean, in recent memory, right, you had the Occupy Wall Street movement, but you also have the Black Lives Matter movement, that you had the Women's March, those kinds of things, realizing that these are all movements that have something in common, that can work together for the common good without having to raise their differences. That's what deep solidarity is all about. So it's an open-ended solidarity. It's a connection that allows people to bring to the table what is most important to them, what shapes them to the core. And of course, that's also a model then for interreligious solidarity, because you don't now, I mean, I'm coming from a Christian perspective, but you do not have to require other religions to give up their differences. You can actually say the Muslim person with whom I'm also working, the Muslim colleague with whom I'm studying and doing research, can bring their difference in a way that it adds something to what I have. What I have is adding something to what somebody else has. The Buddhist colleagues, people from the Jewish tradition, you name it. All of that now comes together in solidarity that's porous, that's open-ended, that's deep in a sense that everybody's needed. In fact, we're stronger because we're all different. On the right, on the other hand, of course, you always need uniformity. So Christians on the right, of course, you see what's happening, right? They have this almost fascist notion of Christianity where only one thing is valid and everything else is wrong. All the other religions are wrong. All the other identities are wrong. And I mean, I could talk more about the real deep problems with right-wing solidarity, but I want to push towards this open-ended solidarity because I think that's what we need in order to move forward.
Yeah, that builds so nicely about what you were talking about earlier, of different ways of thinking about freedom and people of different backgrounds being able to organize together when they have those collective interests.
Yes, that's right, and of course it's something we have to learn now at the same level that we're trying to figure out where we are and how we can make a difference. We have to figure out how can we ultimately work together most productively. However, this is something that's already happening. So it's not like we have to invent it first. But if you think about people's movement, I mean, in the US, of course, the civil rights movement is a good example where you had, of course, the concerns of African Americans front and center. But it was a multiracial movement. It was a multi-generational movement. And it was a movement that in the United States had the labor movement on its side. That's oftentimes forgotten. People think about civil rights, but civil rights and the rights of working people were very closely connected, and that made a difference. This is how some of these movements then became so powerful. And of course, they became so powerful then that they had to get rid of some of these. Himself, Dr. Martin Luther King, got killed precisely at the moment that he put himself on the side of the sanitation workers in Memphis, right. Very close to Vanderbilt University. We're all in the state of Tennessee here, in the southeast of the United States. But ultimately, these developments, this solidarity could never be suppressed altogether. Even, of course, that's the point, that's the project of white supremacy. White supremacy is trying to create a right-wing solidarity among white people in order to suppress other kinds of progressive solidarities. The crazy thing about white solidarity is it's duping a lot of white people into doing the bidding. Not only what's good for white people, but really white supremacy is supporting what is good for the 1% of white people, right? It's supporting the interests of the ruling class, and is actually duping a lot of working class white people to think that this is what helps them, this is what actually contributes to their own well-being. Right. And it doesn't. So in that sense, putting these two solidarities in contrast is really important, because we need to deconstruct some of these false identities, some of these false solidarities that do not benefit. I mean, white solidarity oppresses Black people, that has to be said very clearly, but it also oppresses a lot of white people who are duped to think that this does their own bidding, which it doesn't.
Yeah, that's very well put. I know recently Chris Hedges, who's also an ordained minister, has been talking about how, the United States is a country with 350 million people. I think 1%, according to the Federal Reserve, has $45 trillion of wealth. The idea that it's 11 million undocumented immigrants that's eating away at the working class doesn't really make a lot of sense if you think about the numbers. But there are a lot of people who are led into feeling very passionately that that's where the money's going and that's where the issues are. When, even when we look at where those undocumented immigrants are coming from, the role is often, at the root of it with military coups that were supported by corporate power backed by the US government.
So what you're seeing there is really a false sense of white solidarity that misdirects the real concern of the majority of the population, only to serve the interests of this white small 1% or 0.1% even. By the way, I should mention this. This is what I've just been talking about is subject of a new book of mine that will come out in August that's titled Theology in the Capitalocene. Capitalocene is this word, we talk about Anthropocene a lot, where humanity sort of shaping the history of the planet. I'm talking about Capitalocene because it seems to me capital is what's really shaping the history of the planet right now. Not all human beings, but the small 1 or 0.1% interest is really at stake. And so the book is Theology in the Capitalocene, and the subtitle is Ecology, Identity, Class, and Solidarity. So it ends with solidarity, and the final chapter is actually on reparations for slavery in the United States.
Fascinating. Yes, thank you so much. And I'll post links to your material in this interview as well, so we'll have a chance for people to check out some of your other stuff. I wanted to take a moment to go into history a little bit and how we don't necessarily, you've already sort of touched on it, especially with Martin Luther King Jr., but the way we don't necessarily need to take the idea that religion and a corporate establishment are going to be aligned, that there are powerful counter movements. Even in Canada, I think a lot of important history has been very rapidly erased. Like in Canada, it was an ordained minister, Tommy Douglas, who formed the first socialist government over here. And he's considered the father of our single payer health insurance. In 2004, he was voted the greatest Canadian who ever lived. But still, I think there has been, perhaps because we get so much American media, this idea that religion and corporate power and capitalism are kind of on the same side has become very common, and pretty recent history has been eroded. I know you talk about a big change that happened after the Great Depression hit and the New Deal came in the United States, and it was very popular, and how some of the things that we think of as a taken for granted alignment between religion and the right were really actually pretty orchestrated as resistance to New Deal politics. Can you go into some of the things that maybe were happening before the 1930s and how some of those things shifted as we got into the mid-20th century?
Yes, thank you. This is really a crucial question here, because a lot of people, people wouldn't know necessarily all the details, but even collective memory doesn't remember that, for instance, socialism And also Christian socialism was a big conversation at the end of the 19th century, and then all the way up really to the Great Depression. By the way, I should say this also, if you look at the history of the McCarthy era, you know, what McCarthy then, Senator McCarthy was pushing against, you know, with his witch hunt against socialism and communism, it was a lot of churches and pastors who were suspected of being communists. So even in McCarthy, you know, this is later, there was this suspicion that the churches would be communist and socialist and all of that. We're not at a point where not even that is remembered anymore. So that comes out of that history, going back certainly 100 years and a little bit more, where socialism was not only a conversation that was had, but it was popular movements. Sometimes in places that would surprise you, you know, people might think, well, in the US, you know, the Northeast, you know, the big cities, New York City, those were hotbeds. They certainly were. Not just for socialist movements, but really for socialist Christian coalitions. There were some specific organizations that put this forward. But this also happened in the Southeast and in the Southwest. So for instance, in the early 1900s in Oklahoma, this is now, well, actually the region was southeastern Oklahoma and northeastern Texas. I taught in Texas for about 20 years, so I was local. I mean, I wasn't there when it happened, but did some of the research. There were socialist camp meetings. You may remember that there were a lot of Christian camp meetings that would bring Christians together in the summer, you know, to celebrate their faith and have revivals and all of that. In that part, Oklahoma and Texas, there were socialist camp meetings that would bring together as many as 10,000 people in the summer, where they would not only do talk about socialism, they were also talking about religion. They were using the Bible. So you had some confluence there where people thought this was actually fairly natural. These were, you know, rural populations. These were people that realized that they had more in common with each other. A lot of this was also interracial. This is also forgotten. They realized they had more in common with each other than they had with the big businesses, than they had with the big powerful interests. And politics then was not an idea that had to do with party politics first, but it really had to do with getting the common interests heard, getting a voice for the people, really doing democracy in a way that we can hardly imagine now, you know, where politics is driven by big money and by the donors and by everybody trying to bend their opinion to what everybody else thinks. So those were some of the big movements, and I'd be very happy to be more specific, talk about some of the individual details, but I just wanted to have that broader picture out there so that people realize there was some real popular excitement about socialism that made its way into the churches, that made its way into the city assemblies. I cannot remember the exact number, but I think in those years, if I remember it correctly, there were about 2,000 municipalities and cities in these areas that had socialist mayors. Imagine, right? So they weren't just talking alternative politics. They made it into city governments. You know, they made it into other kinds of regional governments. All of that benefiting the people.
Wow, wow, that's remarkable. I wonder. There is today a great interest in member consumer cooperatives as well as worker cooperatives. And I know there are connections there to the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation, which was started by a Catholic priest and a handful of poor people, that is now quite a remarkable organization, one of the most remarkable organizations really in the world today. I don't know, this is speculation, but was some of that of interest to those movements in the United States around cooperativism?
Yes, very much so. That's really helpful because well, where do I start? So there was an organization called the Knights of Labor in the United States. People should look this up. The Knights of Labor, I believe they were founded in the late 1860s. And this was an organization of working people that certainly had, you know, connections to labor organizing, union organizing, that sort of thing. But the Knights of Labor also incubated a large number of cooperatives. Now, the focus there was really on worker co-ops because the idea was this is about working people having some power, working people taking things into their own hands. You know, earlier we talked about freedom. The basic idea behind here is the freedom of working people. You know, when we think freedom, we think of the freedom of, big corporations and corporate interests and individuals maybe at the top, but they were looking at freedom from the perspective of the freedom of working people to look out for themselves and their own interests. So that was at the heart of it. That was also a religious value here because they thought this is what the Jesus movement was about. So Jesus wasn't just a great preacher. Jesus was also an organizer, somebody who would incubate, these cooperative movements were ultimately, in Jesus's case, was peasant movements working together for the common good. Then a little later with the Apostle Paul, that's something that very few people have recognized yet. The Apostle Paul was organizing urban working classes, right? So all of a sudden you have urban concerns. All of that comes together in cooperatives. Now, I need to say at Vanderbilt University, I'm directing a program called the Wendland-Cook Program in Religion and Justice. And one of our big projects now is we work very closely together with worker cooperatives. We work with an outfit here in Nashville called the Southeast Center for Cooperative Development. And we have a new project called Solidarity Circles, where people are actually working together, incubating co-ops or converting businesses into co-ops on the one hand, connecting that with faith communities. So we have right now a pilot project of churches around the country, not just churches, but religious communities, interreligious, also incubating co-ops because they think this is very much, in the sense of their own religious values. So there is something happening now, especially where
institutional support. That's institutional support they're talking about.
Yes,
wow.
Exactly, and it's in my view something that is only at the very beginning. Now, you mentioned Mondragon. There's this great example in the Basque region in Spain. I believe they now have 70,000 people organized in cooperative enterprises, very successfully too. This is not just a utopia or a dream. This is actually happening. And in the United States, there's the U.S. Federation for Worker Co-ops that is bringing a lot of these cooperative efforts together, because we also realize that just having the co-op here and there is not enough. You have to be connected. You have to do this with all these others who are waking up and realizing there's a different way to do work, to do business. There's a way that people can actually benefit from the profit rather than profit just being siphoned off by the few over against the many.
That's very well put. I would love to come back to this with a question about just what your experience has been talking to people at that grassroots level. But I would first like to, if it's okay, ask one more theory question, and Please. Then just come back to how those person-to-person relationships happen and organizing happens to make it super tangible for people. But the theoretical question I wanted to ask you is because there has been a resurgence in interest since David Graeber wrote the book Debt, the First 5,000 Years, in some of the things that the Bible says about debt, about Jesus's relationship to moneylenders, and about Jubilee and debt forgiveness, as we're seeing, especially, there's been always the concern about government debt. Today, there are questions, especially in that book, about whether government debt is actually a thing we should be worried about. But there's no question at this point that personal debt, household debt, student debt, credit card debt, that poor and working class people are accruing because they are unable to keep up with a decent standard of living otherwise, that it's becoming an insurmountable problem. And that book really opened up an interest in what the Bible had to say about debt and what Jesus had to say about debt. So would you like to touch on that subject a little bit?
Definitely, that's a very big question, but really very close to all that we've been talking about. Maybe the first thing to say about debt is there's some cause and effect. Debt is not a natural catastrophe. It's not something that happens to you, just because you're not doing well enough. It's something that's imposed upon you. It comes out of, for working people, it comes out of the fact that maybe, the way business is done now, somebody is making all the profit and you're not, you're holding the bag, it has to do something with labor relations. In other words, it has to do something, let's use a big word here, with exploitation, so that people have no other option but to go into debt. Now, usually it's the debtors that are being blamed, right? In the Jesus movement, and I think even in some of these, Hebrew Bible traditions, like, in Leviticus, that talk about the sabbatical year and the forgiveness of debt, I think there is some understanding that debt is not a natural catastrophe, but it happens because there's a distortion of relationship, and some people are benefiting from it. So debt and the forgiveness of debt, you're not blaming the debtors. That could even happen, for people who are really all about debt forgiveness. If they're not asking the question, where is this debt coming from? I think there's some really misplaced guilt on people. There's some really misplaced accusations that are wrong. So that's maybe the first thing that has to be said here. And so if you think about the debt forgiveness, let me locate this just with the Jesus movement here for a moment. This much bigger. Jesus didn't invent that. He gets this straight from his Jewish traditions. But when you look at the Jesus movement, this question of forgiveness of debt, there is a realization that people's lives are hard. They endure many hardships, which are not self-caused, which are imposed on them, variously, by the Roman Empire, for sure, but also by people that then make some profit through these systems that are in place. So specific employers, specific landowners, specific masters, vassal kings like Harriet, who are not the Romans, but who work for the Romans and who benefit from it. So there's a pushback against that. And the way you then deal with that is you don't just talk about that, but you talk about how do you empower the people so that on the one hand, they can address that, and on the other hand, they can build more productive relationships so that debt is no longer necessary. Now, if you take this to the Lord's Prayer, this is, of course, a prayer that Christians pray every Sunday at least, or maybe more often. In the current versions, there is the petition for the forgiveness of trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us.
That's what I grew up learning, yeah.
The real term behind this is not trespasses, because trespasses sort of blame somebody. The word is debt. Forgive us our debt as we forgive our debtors. Now, that's a whole different story,
that's
right?
Quite a change. That's a very different story.
Right. That brings into the Jesus movement something to say, well, there are these people who are indebted, and who then, out of this, then their lives get destroyed for sure, but who could really benefit as they, experience forgiveness of debt, and then it really snowballs from there into a whole movement of forgiveness of others. Now, I've argued that this is actually another way of building solidarity, as these people whose debts are forgiving others their debts. It's not just a nice moral thing and a good personal thing to do, or religious thing, but it's really building networks and relationships out of that. If we had more time, I'd give you a little exegesis here of a parable in the Gospel of Matthew, the unforgiving servant, that we may not have time for that, but it's a really interesting parable when you look at how solidarity grows out of debt forgiveness, or doesn't grow out if the debt is not forgiven.
That's fascinating. That's really interesting. And I know it ties into, it seems to me that you talk about both how you feel Christianity can do more good in the world, and also how you are concerned about how big money and capitalism can have a corrosive influence on the religious tradition as well, and can dilute the religious tradition. And what you're saying there seems to feed into both of those, where solidarity can be built so that more good can be done in the world, but also how we can look at how some things have changed that are used to perhaps corrode and dilute the strength of the religious tradition at the same time.
If I could add to that, that's really crucial. That's a great way of summarizing my concerns. Yeah, thanks for putting that out there so clearly. So what I'm really saying is, on the one hand, I'm as a person who studies theology, person of faith myself, I'm tremendously concerned about how distorted this Christianity thing and religion has become. I'm saying there are some resources that could really help us shape things differently, but I'm also saying that religion and Christianity specifically cannot pull itself up by its own bootstraps. So Christianity cannot reclaim some of these ancient traditions that we were just talking about just by itself or by keeping its nose in a book. It has to do it in conjunction with movements. In other words, a solidarity movement that's out there can really help people of faith reclaim the core of their faith traditions. They couldn't do it by themselves. They need that bigger solidarity. In other words, solidarity then becomes the essential thing for religion, not only to save religion, but to make religion, or transform religion back into the power it once had to address some of these things constructively. And that can happen again. It happened in this country 100 years ago. We just talked about these collective collaborative traditions. Religion was part of that. Some of it is happening now again. This is what we're doing in the Wendland-Cook Program, and there are other examples around the country. But we need more of it, and that's where we're headed.
That's fantastic. And that brings us back to the culminating question that I wanted to ask you, which is, in your own very hands-on, grassroots work, organizing programs, organizing with other people. Can you tell us a little bit about what those experiences are like, and how that happens, how that operates, how things get started and how things get built in your experience?
Let me start by saying that I think there's a lot of people who have not given up on their faith traditions, who are very frustrated with their faith traditions, how they have shaped up. That's certainly true in Christianity, but I know this is true in other religious traditions as well. People sometimes think Buddhism is an easy alternative of a more positive religion. But we also know how Buddhism is used and misused to support big business in the United States. It's basically now mindfulness training for corporate types, right?
I think Jeff Bezos was instituting mindfulness kiosks in Amazon fulfillment centers.
There you go. And religious traditions are misused there all the time. There's a group of engaged Buddhists. This is a Buddhist tradition that I think is very promising. I'm working with that also, that are realizing that's not the way to go. Now, let me give you some examples from Christianity, because I think this is the same thing. There is this enormous frustration with the churches, especially, even progressive churches, not being able to really do any of this creative work that we've been talking about. And of course, conservative churches seem to be almost completely cut off from the sources of, whether it's the Jesus movement or, the Hebrew prophets or any of that. You wouldn't even Jesus wouldn't recognize this if he were attending, a conservative church service today. He'd say, well, where am I, right? Maybe he's starting to turn over the tables again. So at the grassroots, there are people who are still hanging on in religious communities who are worried about that. And they're really ready for a conversation. So when we go out there and talk about these things, there's a lot of excitement. There's a lot of people either who are still in faith communities, or people who are really caring about their faith traditions, who want to. If we had a meaningful way of doing this work again in conjunction with some meaningful social developments and movements, we come back. So that's what we're seeing. There's really some deep interest. I even find that in Europe, that's very strange, especially in Germany, where people think this is such a secular country. Hard to imagine here how secularized a country can really be. When we talk about these deeper religious concerns for justice, for freedom, for power of working people, even in Germany, people are getting excited. That to me is fascinating. So that those are some things that we're seeing. And then, of course, you need to think about what are the projects that people need to get excited about. Now, what I see a lot is, religious communities then get concerned about issues of racism and sexism, which are deeply ingrained, of course, deep problems. So far, it's taken a little bit longer to see that there are class issues also, that labor issues are actually at the core of this, not to displace concerns for race and gender, but they're one and the same oftentimes. What keeps down Black communities is not just racism as an abstract idea, but economic relationships that do not have decent jobs and power for Black communities. And the same is true for women in many cases. So once this all comes together, what we're seeing is, it's almost like a revival. That's a strange term to use here, but it's maybe a new great awakening, something like that, where people realize, wow, this is powerful. This actually can change people's lives. This can change the well-being of communities. And you put all of this together, and all of a sudden, the theological work that I do becomes exciting again, because you can now reread your classical sacred traditions. You can reread some of the other traditions. There's a lot that has been done in Christianity over the years, that can be reclaimed. So that's what we're seeing. And at the very grassroots, then, imagine just like a Bible study group where people are reading the Bible. You think, well, that's sort of a religious, narcissistic thing to do, but all these questions become live. Now, this is something I need to say that has happened throughout history. The last time this happened in very big fashion was about 50 years ago in Latin America, with the base communities, gathering around some of their sacred writings, and people talking politics, talking economics, realizing that you couldn't limit religion to the private realm. So that's where the energy is coming from, everything reinforming each other and everything liberating each other in the process.
I think that's a fantastic way to wrap up this conversation. It's been very wide-ranging, extremely illuminating, and I think that's a pretty optimistic, empowering way to wrap it up. So Dr. Rieger, thank you so much for being here today. And I will post links to some of your other work. Is there any particular websites or articles that you would like people to check out first as kind of great starting points?
So maybe the first place to go is to check out the current projects of the Wendland-Cook Program in Religion and Justice. Right now, our website is religionandjustice.org. That's one word, religionandjustice.org. That website may have to be changed, but hopefully we can, keep that link live so that people can find it. And the other project I would recommend is via the Southeast Center for Cooperative Development. Their website is Co-ops Now, but there's a hyphen, co-opsnow.org. Co-opsnow.org with a hyphen between co and ops. If people go to that website, there's actually a link that talks about religion and cooperatives. And this is work that we've done over the past 2 years or so that investigates work, collaborations between religion and co-ops. And it also has materials that grassroots communities can use. I mean, there are some Bible studies on there. There are some videos. There are some interviews. There's also bibliography for people who want to read up more on that. The kind of work that's been done about this is really fascinating, because this is now no longer just a cottage industry. This is, I believe, one of the next big things that's coming. And I really think this is the sort of thing that could help liberate not only religion in a major way, but labor, working people, communities. We believe in the Wendland-Cook Program, this even can have effects on the ecology. If you're worried about climate change, realize that what exploits people is what exploits the planet. What extracts, fossil fuels is what extracts labor from people. It's the same interests. And as we build power, alternative power that finds way to deal with this, I think we really are all better off.
Marvelous. Fantastic. Dr. Rieger, thank you once again so much for taking the time for this interview. This was so informative and so enlightening. Thank you so much for being here.
And thank you for having and asking great questions. I really appreciate this conversation. And I believe there's a lot that we can still talk about, but another time. So thank you.